Hello, this is my final project that is actually based on both ecology and evolution. And what I noticed in an online article in The Scientist, it was written by Bob Grant, and it was about how turtle-headed sea snakes that live in polluted areas of the ocean are actually losing their stripes. This is what the turtle-headed sea snake usually looks like. The picture on the top is the more common coloration with the black and cream, or not exactly white but pale stripes or bands to them. But there are also different variations on their color, as you can see in the picture on the bottom, where there's more of a bluish hue to the lighter colored bands or stripes. But generally, turtle-headed sea snakes do usually have stripes or bands to them. But now, researchers have made the observation that sea snakes that happen to live in more polluted areas of the ocean tend to be darker in color and look like this, where, as you can see, there is no variation in the color whatsoever. There are no stripes, there are no bands, and in fact, there's no other color, not blue, not anything else. They are jet black. So, pollution equals no stripes. There are previous accounts of color change in animals, including probably the most noted being the peppered moth, whose color morphs, would vary between light and dark. And so, with this being the normal look of the peppered moth, they would instead look like this. And it's said that it's most likely just a means of camouflage for the moth. And this is an example of 19th century England's soot-covered landscape, where you can see the regularly colored peppered moth just stands out like a sore thumb, compared to the darker colored moth that is located in the lower left hand corner, which hopefully you can see. Based on where you're sitting, you may not be able to, but I tried to make it very visible. But based on instances such as this, they determined that most likely the darker color is, and possibly is, only a means of camouflage and really doesn't have any other purpose behind it. And then they attempted to, I guess, correlate that logic to what's happening with the sea snake population, which I don't think makes a lot of sense, because the turtle-headed sea snake would most often be found in an environment like this, which is mostly blue, and in my mind, being jet black in this kind of environment wouldn't offer a whole heck of a lot of camouflage at all. So I don't really see the logic in applying that theory of camouflage to the situation that's going on with the turtle-headed sea snake population. Claire Goyrin, I hope I pronounced her last name right, who was actually one of the researchers on the team dealing with the sea snake situation, found research that was done in 2014 on the pigeons of Paris, and how their feathers usually, as you can see in the picture on the left, are usually lighter and have different shades and hues to them, compared to the picture on the right, where the pigeon's feathers are darker, almost black, if not very dark gray. And it was found that those darker feathers have a higher concentration of zinc, And so, based on that study, they determined that most likely the bird sheds or molts those darker feathers to get rid of the harmful levels of zinc before they're able to do any real damage in the bird's body. And so then they said, well, maybe this is the same kind of situation that's going on with the turtle-headed sea snake, and perhaps that principle is being carried over in this situation. So a study was done to try and answer that question. It was actually published in the Current Biology section of Cell, and the study called this adaptation industrial melanism in the sea snake. In order to understand this adaptation of melanism, we first have to know what melanin is. And melanin, I really hope I'm pronouncing it right, is the dark brown or black pigment that occurs in our hair and our skin and in the irises of the eyes of people and animals, and allows our skin and our hair and our eyes to be all these lovely different shades and hues. And it was found that trace elements in pollution actually bind to melanin. So the more melanin that the snake produces in its skin and its scales, the more trace elements bind to that melanin and are therefore expelled when the snake sheds its skin. That's a lot of S's, when the snake sheds its skin. With that in mind, the research team hypothesized that melanism allows the snake to rid itself of harmful pollutants before they can do any real or major damage to the snake's body. But in order to prove their hypothesis, they obviously had to do an experiment. The research team measured the trace elements found in the skins of 1,000 and 400 sea snakes, and they focused around the area of Australia and New Caledonia, and they compared the amounts of trace elements found in darker skin from industrial areas to the amounts of trace elements found in lighter skin from other areas. And in their results, there were definitely higher concentrations of those trace elements, such as arsenic and zinc, found in the darker skins from taken from the industrial areas. And while they were collecting their data samples, they also happened to find that the darker skinned sea snakes, oh my goodness, seemed to shed their skin actually more often than the sea snakes that still had their stripes or their bands. The reason for this is because more algae, or some people say algae, accumulates on darker skin or darker patches of skin. And when sea snakes have algae on them, they shed their skin. Ergo, darker sea snakes shed more often. And the higher rate of algae settlement, which produces higher rates of skin shedding, also increases the rate at which darker skinned sea snakes excrete trace elements from their bodies. In conclusion, the research team determined that due to pollution of the oceans by people, the turtle-headed sea snakes are increasing the melanin in their skin so that trace elements from the pollution will bind to that melanin and will then be excreted when the snakes shed their skin. And since more algae accumulates on darker skin, darker sea snakes shed more often. Therefore, the rate at which trace elements are excreted by darker sea snakes increases exponentially compared to their striped or banded counterparts. Mr. Richard Shine from the University of Sydney was actually one of the lead researchers on this team, and their was a gentleman by the name, I believe his name was Arnie Rasmussen. Hope that's right. And he was a herpet herpetol herpetologist at the Schools of Architecture, Design, and Conservation at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. That is a mouthful. But Mr. Rasmussen actually argued back and forth with Mr. Shine that there are other factors that can explain why this turtle-headed sea snake is getting darker in color and losing their stripes or their bands. Like, he attributed it to possibly being temperature, and he based it on studies that have been done on land-dwelling snakes that tend to be in cooler climates. If they live in cooler climates, then they tend to have darker skin so that they can absorb more sunlight and absorb more heat. And Mr. Shine did not disappoint, because he had something ready for him. He was absolutely familiar with studies of that nature. He had actually done one, he said, but he was also aware of the fact that it doesn't really pertain to aquatic sea snakes, because unlike their land-dwelling cousins, since they're in the water and water is a natural insulator, they don't really need to be darker to be warmer. So that throws out what Mr. Rasmussen, was saying, and his rebuttal to what the research team found in their study. But I also really like another thing that Mr. Shine said. He said it's an encouraging story in terms of rapid evolution, and that here is yet another avenue in which organisms are able to deal with some of the problems that we've raised. And I just think he's trying to really be aware of, he and his team are trying to really be aware of what we're doing as a people to the planet, and to the other organisms that live here. And he's really trying to stay ahead of that in his research. It's not just something that we can brush off all the time. Like, no, a lot of these problems are caused by people. So if you would like to see Mr. Shine's summary of their study and their research and things of that nature, I did put a video link on this last slide. Feel free to check it out. I will also go ahead and copy and paste it into the description of the video below in YouTube. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.